So we'll go ahead and kick this off here, folks. So some of you may know me, some not. My name's Adam Crossett. I'm the staff consultant here with Alchemy. So you all know a little bit about me. I've been working with technology in one way or another for probably better part of 20 years at this point. Everything from higher education, manufacturing, vendor services, and now obviously partner services here at Alchemy. This is our second session of In the Lab with an Expert. This is a platform that we've been working to build over the last couple of months to help us get some of our technical resources in front of a wider audience to just get as much information distributed as widely as we can, especially around the technologies that we specialize in delivering. Today, we're going to be going over some Azure Active Directory kind of 101 level stuff. And since I'm far from an expert in that topic, full disclosure, we've got Alvin Gautreaux on, my colleague here, sir.
Yeah, thanks, Adam. Sure. Yeah, like I said, my name's Alvin Gautreaux. I'm a consultant here at Alchemy. Been working in technology space for well over 20 years now. Primarily the Azure Office 365 space since 2008 when it was launched. So.
Awesome. So like I mentioned, we're going to be covering some basics around strategy and a little bit of the technology around Azure AD, sort of what it is and when it should be used. We're not going to go into an enormous level of detail here, so this is going to be probably a higher level conversation. The purpose is going to be make sure that everybody comes away from this with, if you don't already have one, a good foundational understanding of what Azure AD is and what it's not. Obviously, this is going to be a conversation format here. We're not going to try to kill you with PowerPoint, nor is Alvin going to be demoing anything. But as I interview Alvin here, we're going to come at this, sort of my perspective on this is I'm a legacy, I guess, if you will, on-premise infrastructure architect. I've got enough cloud knowledge to be dangerous, certainly nowhere near the level of Alvin. I've got a handful of questions that I want to go over, as well as some that came in from some of the people attending beforehand. And we're gonna roll through those. There's also a Q&A button you'll see at the bottom of the webinar here. If you've got any questions, please use the Q&A function because it helps us sort of queue and track them versus in the chat. I know I'm going to learn some things today, and I hope you all do too. Before we dig in deeply to the Azure AD thing, Alvin, I wanted to start, and this might bore some people, right? But I wanted to start with on-prem Active Directory and just a very brief review of what on-prem AD is in the sense of what functions that serves for a business today. Can you hit the high notes of that one?
Yeah, sure. So traditional Active Directory, as you know it, the on-prem Active Directory today, and even whenever it was launched in Windows 2000, still pretty much serves the same purpose, right? It's your on-premise authentication and directory structure mechanism, right? It's designed to provide authentication to resources that are confined within a particular forest boundary.
Okay, so it's providing an identity mechanism, essentially an authentication mechanism. What about from a management perspective?
Yeah, so from a management perspective, we have, so maybe take a step back a little bit. So Active Directory was built on the X500 standard, right? Okay. Which provided a tree-like structure, right? So we get this forest at the root, we get domains underneath that. Then we have organizational units that kind of break off from that. We have things like sites that define boundaries. We have and then we have group policy that actually we can apply to domain sites, organizational units to actually manage users and computers within a single forest Active Directory environment.
Okay, so we've got authentication, hierarchical management, and essentially policy application, right? It's in terms of what that's doing for us today. Okay, so then we've obviously had this forever. I'm sure everyone on the call knows it like breathing. Where does AD fall short? What is it not doing for us today that we need?
Yeah, so Active Directory natively falls short on two things, right? So natively, it doesn't like to talk to anything outside of its own forest, right? So it doesn't like to provide authentication to anything outside of its own forest, whether it be another Active Directory environment or a cloud-based application, right? So it's literally confined to, natively, like I said, to its own forest, right? Okay. So that's kind of that's kind of the vision of Active Directory. That's kind of where it's been for the last 22 years. It's literally just a single authentication source for a forest.
Okay. From a protocol perspective, is it? I know you mentioned. I think you mentioned Kerberos before. What are the authentication protocols that Active Directory is talking, and what doesn't it talk?
Yeah, absolutely. That's a great question. So Azure, so Active Directory talks NTLM, Kerberos, LDAP, basically your native authentication protocols, right? What it does not talk is WSFed, SAML, OAuth, OpenID Connect, right? So it doesn't talk the modern protocols that we have today.
Okay, so that would be those would be things used by like SaaS platforms and whatnot, right? Are going to be using those. Okay, so we've got Active Directory today. We've got a hierarchical management structure that's for authentication and policy application. It's talking NTLM, Kerberos, and LDAP, and not talking any of the more modern protocols. Okay, so then understanding that, putting that aside, so that's kind of our framework for what Active Directory is and what it's doing today and what it doesn't do. We've now got Azure Active Directory, which I think, despite what the name implies, is not Active Directory in Azure, right? So what is, at a high level, what is Azure Active Directory doing?
So Azure Active Directory is a cloud identity platform and access management solution for Azure, right? So what does that actually mean, right? What that basically means is that Azure Active Directory actually talks SAML, it talks OAuth, it talks OpenID Connect, it talks SCIM for provisioning. What it does not talk to is LDAP. It does not talk NTLM, those kind of things, right? So it basically is a mechanism that bridges the gap between the deficiencies in Active Directory talking to cloud services and then your identities being able to talk to cloud services.
Okay, so if I've got an on-prem application of some sort today, if I run a development house and I've got a lot of people with SQL Management Studio out there and they're authenticating via Active Directory, that is not going to be authenticated against Azure Active Directory in the future, right? Those on-prem applications, I'm still authenticating against my on-prem AD. Okay.
Well, yeah, and so that's for traditional exe installer applications, probably not. But if it's a web-based application, there's certainly functionality that's built inside of Azure that we can leverage what's called an application proxy to present that application through Azure and actually be able to either authenticate directly via Azure AD if the application supports that, or if the application does not support that, we could actually pass through that authentication request, NTLM, LDAP request back to the on-prem, right? But it's very specific to web-based applications.
Well, okay, so double clicking on that, the web-based application piece. You and I were talking a little bit before this, and you brought up some sort of history of how we got here, right? Can you run through a little bit what we talked about before, right? Between right SaaS coming along and all that.
Sure. Yeah. So just from a little bit of a timeline. So just to kind of date this back, right? So the internet was launched in 1969, right? So that was a long time ago, right? So I wasn't even born yet. But the first SaaS application, and I don't know if a lot of people remember this or not, but the first SaaS application was actually launched in 1991. It was actually Salesforce. Salesforce launched their first SaaS CRM application in 1991. Shortly after that, I think it was around 1995, Amazon launched, and then shortly after Amazon, eBay, right? So that's basically the SaaS applications as they kind of started flowing, right? So around 1995, 1996, 1997 range, we started seeing an uptick in these SaaS applications. But there wasn't really a need at that time to have what was called like an integrated identity or a managed identity for these applications. People seem to be okay with having multiple identities, right? So there wasn't really that business to consumer, business to business models that exist today. If someone wanted to have like a Salesforce SaaS app, for example, like in 1991, at that time it was NT40, probably NT351. They had their on-premise account, and then they had a Salesforce account, right? Same thing with Amazon. You had your on-premise account, then you had your Amazon account. As this starts materializing and growing, this becomes a huge problem, because let's say now you're a company, you're in the 2000s whenever internet's just going crazy, and you have 10 SaaS applications that you're subscribed to. Well, now you have your on-prem identity, right? And then you have 10 separate identities that you have to manage. So this starts becoming a problem that needs to be addressed. And that problem actually didn't get addressed until 2010, roughly. Whenever
was that ADFS? Was that what that?
The ADFS 2.0 release in 2010 provided the WS Fed, so the federation capabilities of an on-premise domain into these SaaS applications that provided a single source log, right? Okay. And so, and keep in mind what I remember what I said in the beginning when I introduced myself. Azure and Office 365, or it was BPOS at that time, launched in 2008. So there was literally a 2-year gap in time where if you were even running those services, you had to manage multiple identities. So, this problem really didn't kind of start fixing itself until 2010. So,
that's a lot of years of a lot of sticky notes under keyboards with a lot of identities, man. Okay.
That's right.
So that was a little tangential to what we're talking about, but I wanted to get some of that background in here because I think it's important. Sure. Sort of circling back to Azure AD specifically, and now that we've kind of framed out the history of the problem and how we got here, what AD can and can't do, what Azure AD is, what is Azure AD not? Can we sort of cover that? Because I feel like it's more not than it is in terms of understanding it.
So and as you kind of alluded to in the beginning, right? So the name kind of confuses some people. So what Azure AD is not is it's not Azure, it's not Active Directory in Azure, right? So it's not a replacement for your on-premise Active Directory. If you kind of really want to think about it from a perspective of how it actually integrates, I guess you could probably say it's an extension of your on-premise Active Directory, right? Okay. But it is definitely not a replacement for on-prem Active Directory, right?
So, and again, because it's not talking any of the modern, or rather Azure AD is talking only the modern protocols, but it's not going to be talking Kerberos, NTM, understanding LDAP queries, none of that, right?
That's right, yeah.
Okay.
So if you have the need for, and I don't really see Active Directory going away anytime soon. I mean, there's going to be always a need for LDAP auth and stuff like that, and single source authentication. So it's just, that's one thing to remember to take away from this, is that Azure Active Directory is not a replacement for on-prem Active Directory.
I even have that written down as something I want to ask you too. In terms of also what it's not, from a directory structure perspective. I know, and again, you and I had talked earlier, and you described it as the great big bucket. So is there, how is Azure AD organized, and does the organizational structure there lend itself to things like group policy, understanding that concept doesn't exist specifically in AAD, but how does that play together?
Yeah, so basically, so Active Directory, kind of like we mentioned a little bit before, is built off of a tree structure, right? So there's a hierarchy to the nature of Active Directory, right? If you're an administrator and you ever got into Active Directory users of computers, you can see the hierarchy, right? It's your domain, it's in your organizational units, and then anything you create under that, right? It's literally a tree structure that was built. That is the complete opposite of Azure Active Directory. Azure Active Directory, from a structural standpoint, is flat. There's no directory structure, there's no tree structure, there's nothing that you could hook into from a management perspective. And the only thing that you really have going for you in Azure AD is that if you wanted to leverage something like group policy to manage users and computers, your best case scenario is to leverage Intune for those policies, because Azure AD is not going to provide that to you. There's no mechanism to manage devices and users that way inside of Azure AD.
So what about the concept of like security groups? Does say such a thing, or security provisionings, segmentations for users and identities in Azure? What's that look like?
Sure, absolutely. Yeah, there's definitely role-based access control, right?
Okay.
For sure. And role-based access control is huge inside of Azure. There are the concept of security groups inside of Azure. So you can build out groups. You can build out Office 365 groups. There's no concept of distribution groups inside of Azure. But for sure, security groups are there, and that's actually critical to the function of Azure, right? We use security groups inside of Azure for all kinds of things. from assigning licenses to users for Office 365 or Microsoft 365 and other services that are inside of there, to providing access to applications, right? So to provide an example of that. So let's say, for example, you have an application that that's a SaaS application that Azure is the identity provider for, right? So basically, we've we've hooked the SAML or OAuth claims together. Those two applications are talking, but I only want a certain segment of my population to be able to access that application, right? Well, that security group is a mechanism for that, right? I only assign that application to a specific security group, and only those users can access that application.
And so via the modern the modern identity communication protocols, can the security group membership or the identity membership, I guess, for Azure AD users, can those be queried by external platforms in the same way that you would query a user security group in Active Directory today?
Yeah, it's basically, yeah, there's a developer function of Azure that's exposed through either the management APIs, Graph APIs, or PowerShell. Primarily, we would like you to use Graph API or PowerShell to access those, but absolutely, if you have, there's certain barriers to entry inside of Azure, so it's not just, anybody can just go query this stuff. But if you either are a guest to the tenant or invited guest to the tenant, or if you have those capabilities, you can certainly run queries against those groups to pull membership. You can see membership inside the portal as well. So very visible in terms of the level of members inside the groups.
Okay. So then, all right. So understanding as much as we can, this is again trying to keep this high level. And folks, for everyone listening, I'm asking Alvin questions that I'm sure are boring him to tears based on compared to what he typically does. And we are going to try to step through in some more depth in some future sessions to sort of tap into more of what he's got to offer. But we really want to start here to make sure we've got a good foundation. So understanding these pieces of Azure AD, the next question that's going to always come up is, for any organization, and we'll step into some specific use cases, but broadly, when do you need to have AAD as part of your strategy, as part of your infrastructure?
Yeah. So the absolute need for Azure AD exists whenever an organization decides that they're going to run some type of Microsoft 365 service, right? Whether that be the entire suite, whether that be just Exchange Online, SharePoint, Skype for Business, or Teams. Just kind of dating myself there.
I caught you there saying Skype for Business. Oh no.
So yeah, Teams or Intune or anything like that. So the reason why those are a requirement, or Azure AD is a requirement for those services, is because Azure AD is the authentication mechanism for Microsoft 365, right? So and I'll kind of phrase it this way, right? So Azure AD can exist without Microsoft 365. Microsoft 365 cannot exist without Azure AD.
Okay.
Right? So.
All right, that makes sense. So then, for organizations who are now looking, say, hey, sure, we have a clear and present need. We've got some amount of SaaS apps. We've got, or maybe we're just moving to 365. We've got Exchange Online, SharePoint Online. We need this. From the security perspective, can you walk through the concerns, if they exist, from an Azure AD security perspective, but also what the Azure AD based identities bring from a proactive security perspective?
Yeah, sure. So security is probably one of the coolest things that actually exists inside of Azure. And the reason why is because it leverages behavioral analytics. It leverages artificial intelligence and things like that to track specific user risks. So what I always tell customers that I'm working with, whenever we specifically talk about identity in the cloud, right, is that three things, right? Protect your identity, and protect your identity, right? It's the foundational mechanism for everything that happens. And Azure provides us with those tools, right? We just have to use them. And some of those tools that we can talk about, first off, is a very simple, streamlined tool called conditional access, right?
As we touched on this earlier, right? This is from a security group equivalent. Okay.
Yeah. So what conditional access is basically the barriers to entry into the platform, right? So like, for example, something simple. Let's say that I have that I require multi-factor authentication for all of my admins that go into the Azure portal, right? That's a barrier to entry, right? So I can't go any further inside the platform unless I multi-factor authenticate into that, right? So that's one mechanism, right? And I can do all kind of things with conditional access. I can control identities. I could also control devices, right? I can set conditional access rules around devices that say, hey, you have to be marked as compliant and in Intune, for example, before you can even access Office 365 services. And if they fall out of compliance, that conditional access rule kicks in, and they don't get access to those services anymore. So I can do all kind of cool things with conditional access rules. But then there are even advancements on that we can do around identity governance, right? So from an identity governance perspective, I can do things like attestation on group memberships, right? So I can basically tag owners of security groups that we talked about earlier, and I can say, hey, I need you every 6 months to attest to the members of this group to make sure they still need access to these applications, right? And then I can set certain conditions, whereas the owner doesn't respond, everybody loses access, right? That would be drastic, obviously, but I can continue to remind them and say, hey, you need to do this, you need to do this. So I can set attestation from a governance perspective around those kind of things.
So this gets us out of the whole world of having literally entire third-party solutions to manage life cycle of things like security group membership and aging out and stuff like that.
Yeah, and just this is basically all inside of Azure, right? So we wouldn't. It's not attestation on-prem or anything like that. It's just specifically inside of Azure. But the really cool thing that I really enjoy more than anything inside of Azure from a security perspective is the identity protection piece, right? So this is basically kind of goes back to a little bit multi-factor authentication, right? But self-service password resets, right? The ability for a user to unlock their account if it's locked out, right? The risk-based and user-based analysis that detects certain things like impossible travel. A person gets a new device and they register it, it'll flag as a low risk in there, and you can do this kind of thing. So basically it uses artificial intelligence, machine learning, and most importantly, behavior analytics. So basically what the person's used to doing, right? So let's say, for example, if I normally log in from a certain IP address, let's say my house in Office 365, and I never go down to a local Starbucks, right, to log in, right? And then one day I just decide, hey, you know what, I'm tired of sitting in my home office. I'm going to go down to Starbucks and I'm going to launch Office. It's going to flag that as a risk because that's outside the normal behavior of what I would do, right? So, but for a person who does it all the time, it's not going to flag it as a risk. It'll flag it the first time, but then it learns from that and says, hey, you know what, this isn't a risk anymore. This
it'll understand this is something this person's doing all the time. And the security flip side of that would then be, just correct me if I'm incorrect here, that for that person who never leaves their home, or maybe they work from a corporate office, that's the only place they ever log in. If they get their password, who knows, shoulder surfed, phished, whatever, and then that malicious actor takes it to Starbucks and tries to authenticate, that's where we're catching that nefarious login, right?
Right.
Okay.
Yep. Especially if it's across large geographical boundaries, right? So let's say, for example, if I'm in Baton Rouge, right? So let's say if I log in Baton Rouge, and then I don't know, 30 seconds later, someone grabs my credentials, and then they log in New York. There's absolutely no way I can get to those two places in that amount of time. So it'll flag that. Now, basically, what we haven't talked about is what kind of action can you take on those kind of things, right? Because it's
my next question. Yeah, absolutely.
Good. Yeah. So it's one thing to know that they're going on, right? It's another thing to do something about it, right? So again, going back to the power of conditional access rules, right? So in conditional access, remember I said we can set conditions on devices or users, right? So one of the conditions that we can set is that, hey, if a user shows up as risky, as high risk, right? So basically our risk categories are high, medium, and low. So if a user shows up as high risk from a user perspective, I want you to basically revoke all their cloud sessions and expire their password, right? Right. Okay. So if there's a combination of, right, so if we look at user risk, but we look at risky sign-ins, right? So let's say, for example, like the impossible travel, we would probably target that as a medium risk, right? A medium risk impossible travel. I want you to revoke their sign-ins and expire their password. That's the most drastic thing that you could do, obviously, is revoke their sign-ins and expire their password. But you can revoke their sign-ins. Like you say, hey, look, if it's a medium risk, I want you to revoke their sign-ins. And essentially what that does is it expires their authorization token, and then they have to go back and re-sign into the applications again, right? Prompting them to therefore multi-factor. So
And so would this be why I'm going to ask you a question here about my own experience? So when I've traveled in the past and I'll sign in, say halfway across the country, I'm working with a customer maybe, and I sign in, I have to re-authenticate. In our case, we're using Okta, but I imagine some of the concepts are similar, right?
yep, they are.
I authenticate, I MFA through, and then I may need to do something leveraging my infrastructure at home, and I have a VPN set up, and I will VPN through. At which point, all of my tokens get very upset about this.
Yeah.
I would imagine that's because it's tripping impossible travel. Is that what's going on?
Well, it's not tripping impossible travel. What it's doing is actually, and that could be right because of your VPN session, right? And that could very well be tripping impossible travel. But more than likely, what it's doing is that you're actually logging in from a location that you haven't logged in before, and so therefore, it's basically saying, hey, you're outside the window of what you normally do, so we're going to force you to, we're going to expire those tokens and have you re-sign in. But it's VPNs are the most common cause of impossible travel that I see. But for the most part, it'll definitely trigger impossible travel.
Okay. So in going down the security hole a little further, we had a question come in around conditional access and wanting to know if either us, Alchemy, or Microsoft have a set of best practices for organizations to help them decide on the best conditional access rules to implement. If are there guidelines around that? Are there things that maybe everybody should start with as an absolute base, and then it becomes judgment calls after that?
Yeah. So there are best practices around that, and anytime that I work with a customer when we're setting up Azure, from the beginning, or if I'm actually doing a security review inside of Azure and we see certain things, there are methods or there are best practices or default conditional access rules that we suggest are put in place for the customer, and it's specifically around identity. Right, so it's identity either from the device level if we're working on Intune specifically, or if it's just Azure specific, it's identity all the way, right? It's multi-factor authentication. It's setting up your trusted boundaries for non-multi-factor requests. It's self-service password resetting, those kind of things. That's risk-based controls like we were talking about earlier, right?
Yep.
Setting those conditional access for those risk-based controls. So we're really focused on from the beginning or the onset or the initial part of the conversation is about protecting your identities.
Absolutely.
So,
okay. I want to keep moving here just to a couple other things. We have a boatload of questions coming in, and I see all those, and we're absolutely going to get to everybody who's asked a question. So if we haven't answered it yet, we will get to it, I promise. Having talked through, so this is the security aspect that we just spent a lot of time talking about, and all of the kind of the wonders of, if you will, the wonders of Azure AD, right? So what is the future of, in your opinion, and I guess from an industry perspective, what's the future of traditional Active Directory? What's the roadmap? Is Azure Active Directory replacing AD? Is it a supplement? How's that fold in?
Yeah, so I mean, there's really no scenario that exists that I don't see Active Directory still hanging around, right? And the reason why is because when you think about technically the process to say, let's ask the question this way, right? Can Azure Active Directory replace AD? Right? All things being equal, no, it can't. But if you can get away from group policy, if you can get away from if you have the ability to shift everything to SaaS applications where you don't need any more on-premise infrastructure, if you don't need access to local file shares, if you don't need access to printing, those kind of things that require either NTLM, NTFS permission setting or anything like that, sure, yeah, absolutely. Azure AD can handle that because you don't have any more of those dependencies. But how many organizations out there can actually say that? Right.
I mean, I can see that clinging on for a long time, right? There'll always be the legacy pieces that require that on-prem. Yeah. Okay. So in short, this is not next generation Active Directory.
Yeah, because even like kind of to expand on it just a little bit. So even some of the customers that I work with today, where we're actually trying to get their file shares, right? So for example, let's talk about file shares for instance. So you have all your file shares. So I don't know of a lot of people who actually have all those file shares imported in SharePoint or some other document management system. or if they're leveraging Azure storage accounts for those. And even the customers that I work with that are leveraging Azure storage accounts that we're transitioning off of like DFS into Azure storage accounts, we're basically kind of taking a one step forward, two step back approach where we're actually domain joining those storage accounts in Active Directory and setting NTFS permissions, right? And so it's one of those scenarios where yeah, we want to get there, but we're going to just kind of step back a little bit. So there's still that dependency on NTFS, NTLM, LDAP, those Kerberos, right? I mean, PKI is huge, right? I mean, you have to figure out how you're going to lift and shift your entire PKI environment, to Azure, which doesn't exist today. So those kind of things. Or dependencies for on-premise Active Directory.
Okay. So, all right. So if AD isn't going anywhere, then and we've got, I guess here's the question. This is from a technical perspective. Maybe you can help me with this. Why, if AAD's function, broadly speaking, right, is additional authentication protocol support. Understanding it does lots of other things, but that's sort of its big core piece. Why create an entire additional system in the form of AAD instead of just stapling on OAuth and SAML support to traditional Active Directory?
Yeah, that's a great question. So my guess is the level of effort to build Azure AD was probably easier than getting Active Directory to support HTTPS sessions for authentication, right? So because it kind of goes back to the purpose of Active Directory, right? Purpose of Active Directory is single domain, single forest authentication. Okay. And so once you kind of start taking an intended purpose of an application like Active Directory and you start expanding it out, then a couple of things will happen, right? So your security posture starts decreasing on that application, right? So basically you introduce more security avenues. And then also you would have to figure out a way to integrate some type of federated mechanism into that platform, like outside of ADFS, to allow for the Kerberoses and the LDAPs and the NTLMs to authenticate across HTTPS boundaries. And then when you look at the port requirements, right? So if you ever set up an Active Directory domain trust, you know that the port requirements are ridiculous, right? Yeah. So can you imagine exposing all those to the internet, for authentication sources, right? So it's all those kind of things jumbled into one where you just say, hey, it's a lot easier if we just go the identity provider route. Plus, at the time, whenever Azure Active Directory was coming on board, right, ADFS was already there. Yep. The OASIS standard framework for modern authentication was already built, right? So SAML, for example, that framework was already built, and it was critical from a Microsoft perspective for them to follow that framework, right? They couldn't really step outside of that box because that was the framework that all SaaS applications were going to march down for providing that authentication.
Okay, so I mean, mechanically it could have been done, but it wouldn't have made sense. The level of effort from an infrastructure perspective, it would have turned directory controllers into something they're not. It would turn them into web servers, right? And okay, all right, that all makes sense. Yeah. I guess it would be we're going to make our car go across the ocean by turning it into a boat, or you could just buy a boat, right? Yeah, okay, exactly. That makes sense. So okay, understanding that. So we have this AD world that's effectively not going away. We have this Azure Active Directory platform that is necessary for more and more apps, right? I don't know what the percentage is, but I got to imagine the majority of freshly developed applications these days are going the SaaS direction. So Azure AD and modern auth is a requirement. Mm-hmm. How do we bridge these two together? AD can't talk cloud and AAD can't talk LDAP. So almost every environment is probably going to be some sort of hybrid. How do we get these two things to play together mechanically?
Yeah, and I think you hit on it with the word hybrid, right? So it's hybrid identity is the key there. And the mechanism to make that happen is Azure AD Connect, right? It's a service that it runs in the cloud now too, but most of the people run it on premise because of certain requirements. But it's a service that runs on premise that syncs either all or part of your directory. You get to choose, right? It's not an all or nothing thing. It syncs all or part of your directory into Azure. And that's what basically creates the hybrid identity model, right? So it syncs everything from groups to distribution lists to to user accounts, computer accounts. It also syncs the MD5 hash of the password into Azure, which is important, right? Because the important part there is that Azure never, in a hybrid identity model, right? That's what we're talking about here, right? So not accounts that you create in Azure that have the on Microsoft designation or anything like that, but in a hybrid identity model where Active Directory is your source of truth, Azure never knows what that password is under any circumstances. Even on a self-service password reset, Azure doesn't know what the password is, right? It's the MD5 hash that's synced from on-prem AD into Azure.
So the nuts and bolts of Azure AD Connect. And so this is if I'm an on-prem organization and I've got to get Azure, I've got to get synced to Azure. Azure AD Connect, this is a box I'm deploying alongside my domain controllers that is running all the time to do is it an interval-based sync? Is it change-based? How does that occur?
Yeah, so the first sync is basically what's called an initial sync. So kind of step back and answer your first question. Yes, this is a box you deploy on-prem. It runs all the time, right? It's a service that runs all the time. The first sync is the initial sync, and then every sync after that, assuming you don't make any changes, is what's called a delta sync, right? So every 30 minutes, it performs a delta sync, except for whenever there's a self-service password change request coming from Azure, and then that basically gets to probably about 2 minutes before that password gets back up to Azure. Or not the password, but the MD5 hash gets back up to Azure.
Okay. You tripped my memory of another question I wanted to ask before. When it comes to the concept of groups in Azure AD and the concept of groups in traditional AD, does Azure AD Connect, does that marry those two things together in any way? Is there a one-to-one if I'm a member of a security group in AD that correlates necessarily to a group in Azure AD?
Yeah, if you're going to manage your group structure that way, essentially you're just going to manage your group structure from on-premise, right? So the groups that you create in Azure AD, there's no one-to-one correlation to the groups that are created on-prem. But if you sync your groups, so let's say, for example, I have a group called all users, right? That basically it's just a query-based distribution group on-prem, and I want to get that group into Azure. Then I just tell AD Sync to sync that group, right? Or I can create a group in Azure called all users, assuming that I sync all my users and have it query all users and dump it in there, right? So I can manage my group split like that if I want to, but there's no way to join those groups together from an AD perspective.
So you are going to be managing sort of two different group sets. Okay, that makes sense.
Yeah. And that's part of the hybrid identity model, right? Is that you want to basically take your management capabilities that you have on-prem and extend them into Azure as well. So,
I want to hit a couple of questions. They're going to be a little deviations from the train that we're on, but I want to make sure we get to them. So let's see. So a customer says, we're noticing impossible travel notices often. The IP address will resolve to a mobile carrier with the assumption being, that it's the carrier reassigned address on a cell phone tower. They're hard to diagnose. Do you see any of these, and what do you typically help folks with when it comes to working around or accounting for them?
Yeah, sure. So that's a great question. And we do see these a lot, right? And cell phone carriers are typical, right? Especially whenever you're bouncing around cell phone networks, like if you're traveling in your car or something like that, and you have, Teams loaded or Office 365 loaded. The important thing to note is that, and this is what I always tell people, is that this may be, historically speaking, maybe what was considered to be a false positive, right? However, be very careful about tagging things as false positives. And because what you want Azure to do is you need to tag them as legitimate business use cases, right? So go ahead and say, yeah, you know what, this is a legitimate risk, but it's how we do business. So that way Azure learns the behavior of that user. And so then as time goes on and things happen within the platform, you start seeing those risks reduce, right? It starts, because you don't want to necessarily put something like that as a false positive, because then what happens is Azure goes, okay, well, I'm not going to look at that anymore, right? You wanted to look at it. You just wanted to recognize the fact that this is part of your business, right? This is how we do business. This is the user behavior that we expect. And so there's a little bit of training that has to go on, as with anything, right? So Azure just doesn't come out of the box and understand what my behavior is, right? That's a learning process. But, someone really has to take the initiative in companies to actually monitor the identity governance or identity protection piece of this to make sure that their Azure environment understands the risk-based behavior that's going on inside the organization, and then be able to alert whenever it deviates outside of that risk.
Okay, and that makes sense. There's no, so for all of the, AI's machine learning, it's doing a lot of, it's got a lot of smarts baked in. But you're
Mhm.
saying there's still fundamentally no substitute for a human being watching the identity logs and understanding, hey, I run a bank. I have 100 tellers who work here. My tellers should not be showing up bouncing between cell towers or something similar, right?
Right, exactly.
Okay.
Yeah, because I mean, you want them to still look at that, right?
Yeah.
And if I travel from, like for example, like we talk about like traveling, right? Is one of the things that'll trigger an alert in Azure. Is let's say that I'm a brand new Office 365 customer. I got my email up to Office 365. I'm authenticating to Azure, and I'm in New York, and I jump on a plane and travel to California, right?
Yeah.
I may have done that a million times before I got to Office 365, right? But Azure doesn't know that.
Sure.
And so the first time I do it, I have to say, no, this user did do that. It's outside the norm of what you see, but this is normal behavior for them. So I have to start kind of adjusting that, right? So, especially, if you see that kind of stuff, or if you see, people have like multiple devices, for example, this is a huge, right? So people change cell phones, or they have like their iPhone, their iPad, and their laptop or whatever,
Mm-hmm.
and they log into all those devices at one time. Azure looks at that and goes, "Oh, hang on a second. What's going on here? What's up with this user?" And so it has to learn that no, this user normally logs into 6 different devices because that's required to do their job, right? So those are the kind of things that you have to kind of start monitoring on the identity protection level to make sure Azure understands the framework within how you do your business.
Okay. Oh, that makes sense.
Yep.
So I got a couple more questions. I'm gonna do one more question here from the folks in the audience. Then I've got something that I want to check on too here.
Okay.
So this is around, okay, Microsoft recently announced auto patching for use with Azure AD with Intune. Do you see this as being something that could be rolled out to a large number of systems, either a whole organizational unit in AD, or would this be more of a niche role for a few systems that struggle with traditional monthly patching? This is a little more
Yeah, no,
down
it's
the
okay
policy
there.
Intune route.
Yeah, yeah, that's a good question. So, boy, I have a lot of thoughts on this one. So, there's this for whatever reason, there's it's just probably history, right? There's a concept where people try to carry forward behavior that they've done on-prem into the cloud, right? And so a lot of the organizations that I work with, when you look at their patching cycle, they say, well, we want to stay 30 days behind, right? That's basically their method. We're 30 days out. Well, that's not a bad philosophy on-prem, I guess, depending on how you look at things. I mean, domain controllers, I don't know, probably do real-time patching, but anyway, but anyway. So, but if you're deploying infrastructure in Azure, again, my fourth, I said earlier, right? I always say protect your identity, protect your identity, protect your identity. My fourth point of that would be you probably need to patch your systems, right? So, so being a month behind on an environment that is as vast as Azure is not really a good thing. And if you ever deploy any type of the Defender for Cloud security models around your infrastructure, they will alert you all the time about high security alerts if you're a month behind, right? So if you're the type of person that looks at those alerts and goes, okay, yeah, and again, even if you deploy security solutions outside of Defender for Cloud, right, that's looking at your Azure environment, right, whether that's CloudStrike or something else, they're going to alert you on things. Rapid7, for example, they're going to alert you on things that if you're outside of a month, you're going to get high alerts all over the place. And it's because of the world changes so fast inside of Azure, from threat vectors to everything else that you have to be concerned about. It's a lot different than being in a single siloed forest model that is very controlled, right? So I guess kind of to answer your question, going back to that question. So I think auto patching is a great idea, right? I think auto patching is a great idea. It takes you out of the business of being able to manage that kind of stuff. And based off of like just simply reporting that your servers are actually going to get patched. Now, this is such a critical point for Microsoft that in Server 22 Azure Edition, right, there's a functionality called hot patching, where now they have the ability in that version of the server that if you deploy that in Azure, that it doesn't even require a reboot anymore. It's literally just hot patching that's getting applied to the service. So that's how critical this actually is to managing your infrastructure as it relates to an Azure environment. So, again, I mean, do I think you should translate that to on-prem? My personal opinion is that, patches come out on patch Tuesday, I'd probably patch on Wednesday. But that's me, right? I live in a different world than most people. But in Azure, I would certainly consider maybe not Wednesday, but maybe Thursday, right? So, yeah.
Okay. Thank you for, I'm thinking about my own sordid history in running WSUS servers and things like this on-prem. But that question hit home for me. All right.
Yeah.
So talking about, you touched on sort of the thinking about new systems in old ways, and something that I came across in prepping for this conversation was Azure AD Domain Services, right? As a way to, on first read, if you read Microsoft's articles, it would sort of give the implication that, well, this is kind of a way to run AD in the cloud or something. I can still get LDAP, but it's actually managed. Can you run through what Azure AD, Azure Active Directory Domain Services, what this is and why one would want to use it?
Sure. Yeah. So basically, what Azure AD Domain Services is, it's like a managed service for Active Directory, right? And so I'll kind of describe a little bit of the framework of the platform first, and then we'll kind of go into the specifics, right? So, so it's a service that you deploy through the Azure portal. You just go in and search for Azure AD Domain Services, and you pick your domain and everything else. But the fundamental issue with Azure AD Domain Services is that you get 4 domain controllers, right? So let's say, for example, if I deploy Azure AD Domain Services in South Central District or South Central Region, I get 2 domain controllers in San Antonio, and then I get 2 in Chicago because that's my peering region, right? As it relates to Azure. That's it, right? Now, I don't have any line of sight to these domain controllers, right? These are virtual machine scale sets that run inside of Azure. I can't log into these things. I am not a domain admin. I'm not a schema admin. I'm not an enterprise admin. I can't deploy services like Exchange on-prem or like SharePoint on-prem or anything like that that's going to go and modify the schema of those applications. It's simply an authentication forest. That's all it is, right? So yeah, so it's the original design for Azure AD Domain Services was for companies that needed access to Azure and Office 365 or other SaaS-based applications where Azure was going to be the identity provider, but could not expose, for whatever reason, their on-prem services to Azure, right? They security boundaries existed where they couldn't access the endpoints or something like that. So that's what Azure AD Domain Services was designed to do, is to stand up that service and function as an authentication source for those environments, right? It is not a replacement for on-prem Active Directory.
Okay. That puts a ton of clarity to that. Because again, reading through Microsoft's articles on it, they sort of seem a little ambivalent about how they would want you to use that. But that's very interesting. Okay.
Yeah, it's strictly if you need LDAP access or something like that, and you don't want to expose on-prem AD. I mean, but keep in mind, right? You're not going to sync your on-prem AD into this domain. This is a separate domain, separate forest, right? This is not a child domain on your existing forest or anything like that. This is a completely separate forest, right? When you think about it from that perspective, this is not, if you're, company1234.com, right? You're not going to stand up another Azure AD Domain Services instance for company1234.com. This is something completely different. Right, this is outside the realm of that, so it's not the same thing.
So, and I had asked one of our other Microsoft architects about this in the past, and I'd said, I hear a whole lot of scenarios where Azure AD DS is not the answer, right? Do you have off the top of your head? And if you don't, that's fine. Can you give me an example of have you run across a real life customer scenario where it has been a good idea to roll this out?
Yeah. So if we're just using it for authentication purposes, like one of the best use case scenarios is a test bed for Azure Virtual Desktop, for example. Where you can stand up a test domain and you want to test authentication to that domain where you're not going to deploy other services into it. That's a great example, right? So Azure Virtual Desktop is probably the best example I can think of at the moment, but that's a real case scenario that exists where you could stand up Azure AD Domain Services, and you have the ability, because it's not doing anything schema related, right? It's just authentication. and you have the ability to, Azure AD users and computers manipulate the group policy structure. You can't apply group policy, right? But you could manipulate the group policy structure to support Azure Virtual Desktop.
Okay, no, that makes a huge amount of sense. So I want to run through that's all the questions I had, and I can probably come up with some more at some point. But we got 6 or 7 here. I want to hit from the audience. So
yeah, sure.
Okay, one is, do you have any insight into the best practices for managing an environment with multiple companies, some of which maybe utilize Okta as well as Azure AD, and some of which only utilize AD or Azure AD?
Yeah. So let's start with this, right? So you can take all those scenarios and you can federate those environments together, right? So specifically the Okta Azure AD environment, right? You could even the on-prem, right? I can federate my on-prem with Okta, and Okta could do the provisioning, Azure AD could do provisioning, but I could federate them with ADFS. But I think the question you really need to ask yourself is, do I want to manage all that stuff? And the point that I'm getting at there is pick an identity provider, right? Just they're whether it's Okta, whether it's Ping Federate or Azure, they all pretty much do the same thing. So pick an identity provider and level set on that and go that route, because I would think from an administrative perspective, you don't really want to get into the business of managing. Now you're already going to be managing multiple identities, but do you want to manage multiple identities and multiple identity providers, right?
Right, and yes, right, and the skim solution that would have to sort of screw all that together, right? Okay.
Right. Yeah. So that would get kind of a messy thing, and then from a company perspective, the world we live in now in technology, where pretty much people rotate in and out of businesses like crazy. You'll put yourself in a situation where one guy knows everything, and then he leaves, and then you're like, oh, I don't know how to manage this stuff.
Okay.
Right. And so if you kind of streamline your approach to identity, it'll definitely make a lot more sense and a lot more easy management. So.
All right, how about, let's see this, migration from AD best practices, especially around the normalization of user data, extensibility of object attributes, compatibility with dynamics. Can you touch a little bit? I know specifically on the normalization of user data. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah. So, and we can kind of hit on all that, right? So, in Dynamics, I'm making an assumption that it's Dynamics 365 in the cloud, right? Basically, there is no migration path from AD, right? Like I said before, it's Azure AD is not a replacement for on-premise Active Directory, right? So what you have to do is you have to leverage a hybrid identity model, right? So that's going to be the hybrid identity. So basically, whenever I refer to hybrid identity, and for this conversation, specifically referring to Azure AD Connect, right? That is your normalization, right? So that's going to determine, like in the cloud. So even for Dynamics 365, Azure is the authentication source for Dynamics 365, right? It is a 365 application. The accounts have to live in Azure, right? So you can determine what's going to be your anchor inside of Azure, right? Most people will pick by default the user principal name, but what happens is you have your cloud anchor, and then you have an on-premise anchor. Right, your cloud anchor is what's commonly referred to as the immutable ID, right? So that exists for every single account that's in Azure. It gets created whenever the account is actually synced in Azure. And then that relationship of that account back to on-prem is what's called the MSDS consistency grid, right? Those two attributes match, and that's what links those two accounts together, right? So that's essentially your normalization, right? That's your not your normalization, but that's your connection between those two accounts. Now, your normalization is how the user is going to log in, right? Typically, we like to use user principal name. And so that's going to be the normalization from an authentication perspective.
Yeah, that makes sense. All right, okay, so we've got stale device removal set to 90 days. However, I discovered that this only affects devices in EPM, but it doesn't remove the item from AAD. Is there a way to automate this removal? There's a Microsoft KB with a script. But we prefer a more baked solution than that.
Yeah. So this is an issue that I talk about a lot, right? So, if you have like Intune or some other device management platform, you can set device cleanup rules, and you can say, hey, every 90 days or whatever, clean this device up. It doesn't really exist in Azure, and so the automated way to do it in Azure is to do either a logic app or a runbook, right? Obviously, the mechanism to perform that action is PowerShell. And we have a bunch of services that we could either talk about or links that we could provide that talk about how to do the logic app or the runbook. But essentially, that's going to be your automation, right? So you're going to create the logic app or the runbook, and you say, hey, we want you to look at these accounts, and any accounts that have 0 activity dates inside of Azure, we want you to first disable those accounts, right? If they're enabled, right? So disable the computer accounts, and then also remove them. Now, that's for accounts that reside only in Azure, right? For the devices that only reside in Azure. For devices that reside in on-premise Active Directory, those devices should be managed from on-prem Active Directory, right? So if I disable a device in AD, and if I delete a device in AD, the expectation is that device is removed from Azure, right? So that's kind of how that's actually managed.
Okay. So I know, and I hate to cut this off because I'm loving this talk that we're having. I want to make sure we sort of wrap. I got one more quick question before we wrap up, because I think it's a really good one. Given that Azure AD is considered Microsoft's identity solution, what limitations exist in it that result in the market created for the third-party stuff like Okta and Ping? Are there a couple of high-level items there?
Yeah. So the big thing, so like I said, Azure pretty much does the same thing. And we'll kind of pick on Okta. We'll kind of not pick on Okta, but we'll kind of do a comparison of Okta here real quick, right? So they both do exactly the same thing, except for 2 things, right? Number one, Okta doesn't really deal with devices too much, where Azure does. And then Okta is probably better on the access management piece, right? So the provisioning piece, okay, like that, right? So, and that's kind of really where the dividing line is, right? And so, and that's why the market exists for these, right? Azure is only going to go so far. You're going to like, hey, we're going to provide you this road, and this is how we're going to do things, but we're only going to go so far. So other providers have got to step up. And this is a traditional mechanism for how Microsoft does everything, right? It's like it relies on other providers. They'll get you so far, but if you want something beyond that, right, whatever that road, whatever that line in the sand is, then that's where other providers come in. And that's where Okta does, a better job on the access management piece, right? And we talk about provision. And so, like, for example, if you want to provision an application from like an HRM application into Azure, then back into Active Directory, Azure can do that, but it's a much longer path than what Okta can provide you. That's it.
Okay. We have missed a couple of questions. I'm sorry for the folks who asked and didn't get them answered here. I want to make sure we're respectful of everybody's time, though. I can't thank you, Alvin, enough for coming and having this talk with me. Obviously, you're the busiest man here, and it was great to get some of your time to walk through this stuff. I'd ask for everybody who's listening here on the webinar, thank you all for joining us. Obviously, if you've got AAD set up today and you want to make sure it's set up correctly, or you just want to be able to pick Alvin's brain a little bit, by all means, reach out to us. You can find us either at info@alchemytechgroup.com if you're not an existing customer, or if you are an existing customer, then by all means, harass your favorite account rep. If you don't have an AAD presence today and you want to make sure it gets set up correctly moving forward, again, we've got Alvin, we've got a lot of Microsoft talent of his caliber, and be happy to work with you to get that going. Obviously, again, reach out to either info@alchemytechgroup.com for that, or to your account rep. There will be, as the last question, there will be a recording of this made available. Yes, that will be either published on YouTube, or the meeting link will be provided to the people who are on the call. So we'll get that out there. I appreciate everybody coming to this today. And again, Alvin, thank you so much for your time on this. It's been, I think it's been a really good conversation.
Yeah, thanks everybody for joining.
All right, everybody have a good rest of your Wednesday.